The first letter arrived on a Thursday. It was folded 3 times, slipped under my front door, the edges damp from the evening air. At first glance it looked ordinary. White paper, black ink. The neat insignia of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association printed like a badge of honor at the top. But when I opened it, the words pressed against me with a weight that felt far heavier than paper should carry. Unauthorized structure. Violation of Bylaw 14C. Penalty $5,000. The ink seemed to pulse under the kitchen light as I read it again and again, wondering if my eyes had betrayed me. They hadn't. What they were calling an unauthorized structure was nothing more than the dam I had built in the back corner of my lot, where the soil dipped and water pooled each spring until it gnawed away at my foundation. I remember standing at that spot months earlier, shovel in hand, staring at the land that never quite belonged to me. Maplewood Creek, they called it, though it was little more than a swollen ditch, a forgotten scar from when the neighborhood was carved out of farmland years ago. Every heavy rain sent its waters swelling, turning my backyard into a bog, crawling up toward my garage. I had served in the army for 12 years, and in those years I had seen water take lives, equipment, and entire outposts. It had taught me that waiting was dangerous. So I built, quietly, without fanfare, stone by stone, pouring concrete where needed, reinforcing with timber I hauled in the back of my truck. It wasn't beautiful, but it was strong. And when the rains came again for the first time, my house stood dry. I thought that would be the end of it. But Maplewood Estates was a place where nothing ended quietly. The board was always watching. They prided themselves on manicured hedges, mailbox heights, and the shine of chrome numbers against brick. The dam, though hidden behind my fence and out of sight from the street, somehow became their obsession. That first letter was not a warning. It was a shot across the bow. I set it down on the counter and walked outside. The neighborhood looked as it always did. Perfect lawns, trimmed to uniform height, driveways gleaming under fresh coats of sealant, porch flags swaying gently in the evening breeze. But there was something about the silence that unsettled me. The Smiths across the street, who usually waved, lingered too long in their garage before shutting it with a thud. The Bennetts, 2 doors down, stood at their mailbox pretending to sort envelopes that had no writing on them. I could feel it then, the eyes watching, measuring, waiting for me to make a move. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of water pressing against the dam filled my mind, a constant rush like a pulse that wouldn't settle. I walked out to the creek under the cover of darkness. The moonlight shimmered against the waterline, and my dam stood tall, solid, unyielding. It was the only thing in this neighborhood that felt like it belonged to me, and yet it was the very thing they wanted torn down. By Saturday morning, a second letter came. This time taped directly to my front door with a strip of blue painter's tape. The same insignia, the same sterile font. Failure to comply. Escalation of penalty $10,000. Immediate action required. My hands trembled as I peeled it free. It wasn't the number that shook me. It was the escalation. The no certainty that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. I drove to the clubhouse that afternoon, the heart of their operations. The building sat at the center of Maplewood Estates, like a throne room disguised as a community space. Behind its glass doors lay the board, President Carol Whitaker, Vice President Thomas Green, Secretary Linda Powers, Treasurer Alan Cho, and the ever-smiling enforcer, Sandra Wells. They sat at a long table, papers neatly stacked, each armed with pens like weapons. "Mr. Hayes," Carol began, her voice sugary but sharp, "you're here regarding the violation notices?" "Yes," I said, keeping my voice calm though my chest burned. "I built a dam to keep my property from flooding." "It's on my land. It's not harming anyone." Alan adjusted his glasses, glancing at a paper in front of him. "That may be how you see it, but according to our bylaws, no resident may construct permanent structures without board approval." "You did not seek approval." "It's behind my fence," I replied. "Out of sight, out of mind." "How did you even—" Sandra leaned forward, smiling that hollow smile. "We have ways of ensuring compliance, Mr. Hayes. Neighbors care about the integrity of our community." I looked around the table. Their eyes gleamed with something beyond concern for bylaws. It was control, authority. The dam had become a symbol of defiance, and defiance was something Maplewood Estates could not tolerate. When I left the clubhouse, the air felt heavier, as though I had walked through a storm that hadn't broken yet. The letters had been the beginning. The meeting was the declaration. A battle line had been drawn, not of stone and water, but of paper, ink, and intimidation. By the end of that week, another letter arrived, this one more aggressive. Failure to comply. Accrued penalties $20,000. Notice of lien pending, a lien. They were threatening to take my home, my sanctuary, my only refuge after years overseas. The house I had rebuilt piece by piece, board by board with my own hands. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. I sat on my porch that evening, staring at the dam through the gap in my fence. For the first time, doubt seeped in. Could I fight them? Could I resist a machine built on rules designed to crush outliers? The sound of sprinklers ticking across lawns filled the night, a rhythm of enforced perfection. I knew then that the dam wasn't just concrete and stone. It was a rebellion. It was mine, and I would not let them take it without a fight. The conflict had begun. The letters did not stop. They multiplied. Each morning I would step out to retrieve the paper from my driveway, and tucked inside the rolled newsprint would be another notice, folded with mechanical precision, stamped with the seal of the board. Sometimes they arrived at night, slipped under the door so that I'd find them waiting like threats in the dim light of dawn. The fines doubled, then tripled. The tone of each notice grew sharper, no longer hiding behind formal language but dripping with accusation. Continued defiance will not be tolerated. Those words appeared in bold across the top of one, and as I read them aloud I realized something chilling. They were no longer concerned with a dam. They were concerned about me. Neighbors began to change. Where once there were polite nods and waves across yards, there were now curt glances, quick retreats indoors, and curtains that twitched shut when I walked past. So I saw them sometimes at the edge of my vision, men with cameras slung around their necks, women clutching clipboards as if they were shields. They called themselves volunteers, part of the HOA compliance committee. But what they really were was enforcers. They measured grass height in inches. They photographed trash cans that lingered too long by the curb. They recorded every detail as though gathering evidence for a trial I didn't know was coming. It wasn't just me. I noticed other houses too, beginning to show the signs of pressure. A car left overnight on the street was tagged with a citation. A flagpole slightly taller than regulation was declared a violation. Each family that faltered seemed to withdraw further into silence, as though the only way to survive Maplewood Estates was to bow low and hope the board's gaze shifted elsewhere. But their gaze never shifted, it spread. One afternoon as I worked in the garage, I saw Sandra Wells parked across the street in her white SUV. She wasn't hiding, not really. She wanted me to see her there, phone in hand, watching. I could almost feel the camera lens on my skin, cataloging every move, every gesture. When I stepped into the driveway, she lowered her window and called out with that saccharine voice of hers, still holding out, Mr. Hayes. You'd make it easier on yourself if you just followed the rules. I said nothing. The clatter of my tools was answer enough. But inside, anger festered. These weren't neighbors anymore, they were jailers. And I was their prisoner, held not behind bars but inside property lines I had paid for with my own sweat and savings. The dam, of course, became their rallying cry. Rumors spread like wildfire. At the grocery store, I overheard whispers that I had diverted the creek illegally, that my dam was endangering the whole neighborhood, that if it failed, houses would flood. The lies multiplied until they were treated as gospel truth. Parents pulled their children away when I walked down the sidewalk. Friends I had shared barbecues with crossed the street to avoid me. The board didn't have to raise a hand. They let paranoia do their work. Then came the inspection. 2 men in reflective vests arrived unannounced, claiming to represent the HOA's safety task force. They knocked with fists that rattled the glass in the front door. When I opened it, one shoved a clipboard toward me. Unpermitted structure. Hazard assessment, he barked. This is my property, I told him, standing tall in the doorway. You don't have the authority to be here. He smirked, flipping the page. Bylaw 7 grants the board access to common safety concerns. You're required to comply. I refused. I closed the door. But later that evening, I found them standing by the creek, snapping photos of the dam from over the fence. They had trespassed, and yet in their minds, they were justified. To them, Maplewood's rules were higher than law itself. The following week, a new letter arrived. Final warning. Penalty $50,000. Immediate compliance is required. Demolition. Order pending. My chest tightened as I read it. 50,000. The number was absurd. More than the dam, more than repairs, more than anything rational. It was never about the money. It was about breaking me. They wanted me to bend, to bow, to admit they owned not just the neighborhood but the people in it. The walls of my own home began to feel foreign. I found myself checking the blinds more often, listening for footsteps at night, wondering if the next knock on the door would come from men with clipboards or men with badges. Each sound outside, the crunch of tires on gravel, the creak of a gate, made me sit up straighter, ready. The army had taught me to expect ambush, but I had never thought I'd need that instinct here in suburbia. One evening I caught Thomas Green, the vice president, standing at the edge of my lawn. He was dressed in slacks and a polo, a clipboard tucked under his arm. When I stepped outside, he didn't flinch. "Mr. Hayes," he said evenly, "you're forcing our hand. If you don't remove the dam, we will. And when we do, it won't just be the dam you lose." His words lingered long after he left. Not just the dam. He meant the house, the land. My peace, everything. I thought about tearing it down myself, ending the battle before it grew worse. But then I walked out to the creek again under moonlight. I ran my hands across the cool stone, the firm timber, the structure I had built to protect what was mine. It stood strong, resolute, a reflection of the stubbornness that ran through my blood. No, this wasn't just a fight over concrete. This was about refusing to surrender to people who saw power as ownership. Still, the pressure weighed heavily. I woke with headaches. I ate a little. I scrolled through bylaws late into the night, trying to find loopholes, trying to understand how they twisted words into chains. My house smelled of paper and ink, violation letters stacked like bricks around me. And outside, the cul-de-sac grew quieter, colder. The sense of community that had once been Maplewood's pride had decayed into suspicion. Everyone was watching. Everyone was afraid. The escalation was no accident. It was a strategy. They wanted me isolated. They wanted me desperate. And as I lay awake listening to the hum of street lamps outside, I wondered just how far they were willing to go. The answer I knew would come soon. It was a neighbor who first whispered about the meetings. His name was Peter Lang, a quiet man who lived 3 houses down. The kind of neighbor who kept his lawn respectable but never joined the block parties or barbecues. Late one night as I was taking out the trash, he stopped at the edge of my driveway. His eyes darted to the darkened windows of the street before he spoke. "They meet on Thursdays," he said quietly, voice gravelly, almost conspiratorial. "Not just the board. Others, too. The clubhouse. No notices. No minutes recorded. They don't want people to know." Before I could ask anything, he walked away, disappearing into the night as though he had never spoken. The air around me felt heavier. Secret meetings. It explained so much. The speed of the escalation, the certainty in their threats, the way neighbors seemed to change overnight. If the board was conspiring behind closed doors, then the dam was only the pretext. What they were building was something larger, more suffocating. The following Thursday, I parked my truck at the far end of Maplewood Drive and walked quietly under the cover of darkness. The clubhouse windows glowed faintly, pale squares against the blackness of night. I moved closer, keeping to the hedges. Through the glass I could see them, Carol at the head of the table, her blonde hair gleaming under the fluorescent light, Thomas Green leaning back with his arms crossed, Sandra Wells scribbling notes, and others, faces I recognized from the cul-de-sac, neighbors I had once trusted. The Smiths, the Bennetts, even young Melissa from the corner lot, barely 25, her laughter once a bright thing at summer cookouts. Now she sat there like an acolyte, nodding at every word. They spoke in low voices, but I caught fragments through the hum of the air conditioning. Words like compliance and foreclosure and liability. Carol's voice rose above the rest, smooth and sharp. "He's making an example of himself," she said. "If we let him keep the dam, others will follow. We can't risk that kind of disorder." The others nodded. Sandra tapped her pen against the table. "The fines alone won't break him." "He's too stubborn. We'll have to escalate." The room fell into silence for a moment, then Thomas leaned forward. "Leanne, foreclosure proceedings. And if he resists? Well, we've handled resistors before." My chest tightened. Handled resistors. The words echoed like a threat carved in stone. These weren't neighbors seeking order. They were rulers cloaked in community titles, waging war not with guns but with signatures and silence. I pulled back into the shadows, my heart beat loud in my ears. As I walked home, every step felt heavier. The betrayal cut deeper than the fines or the threats. These were people I had broken bread with, people who had once smiled and asked about my service, people who had borrowed tools from my garage. And here they were, plotting my ruin behind closed doors. The following day, the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted again. Melissa, the young neighbor who had once laughed at block parties, now stood by my mailbox as I arrived home. She smiled thinly, her eyes glinting. "You should really think about tearing that thing down," she said softly. "The board's patient, but not forever. And trust me, you don't want to see what comes next." It was the voice of someone rehearsed, someone instructed. Betrayal wore her face now, bright and cruel. I closed the door on her words, but they lingered inside me like a stain. That weekend, Peter returned. He knocked once softly, and when I opened the door, he slipped inside quickly as though he feared being seen. His hands trembled as he held out a folder. Inside were copies of internal memos, photocopied agendas from those secret meetings. He must have risked everything to get them. "They've been planning this for months," he whispered, pacing my living room. "Not just you, others before you." Small violations turned into massive fines, liens, and forced sales. They used the money to keep the board funded, to pay for their pet projects and their private security. Your dam is just the excuse they needed. I flipped through the pages, each one a dagger, notes about expedited foreclosure and target households, lists of names, neighbors who had once lived here, now gone, their homes flipped, their stories erased. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Peter stopped pacing, his eyes haunted. "Because I should have spoken sooner. They took my sister's house last year. She was late on dues, only a few $100s. They bled her with fines until she couldn't keep up. They forced her out. I couldn't stop it then. But maybe—" His voice faltered. "Maybe you can." In that moment I realized the battle wasn't just mine. The dam had become a symbol, but beneath it ran a river of hidden pain. Families displaced, homes stolen, neighbors broken by the same machine that now set its sights on me. The board's corruption was deeper, older, and far more insidious than I had imagined. Still, knowledge did not bring safety. That night I returned home to find another letter taped to my door. This one was different. No fines listed, no citations, just a single line typed across the page. "You can't stop the tide." My hand clenched the paper until it tore. It wasn't about bylaws anymore. It was psychological warfare, meant to weaken, to erode, to drown me before the real strike came. The betrayal stung, but they also steeled me. For the first time, I wasn't just defending a dam. I was preparing to expose them. If they wanted to fight in shadows, I would drag their secrets into the light. The question was how long I could withstand the storm before it broke me. It began subtly, almost invisibly, like a sickness spreading through the air. A porch light that stayed on just a little too long when I walked by. The curtains were shifting when I pulled into my driveway at night. Footsteps echoed faintly down the sidewalk, always stopping the moment I turned to look. At first I thought it was nerves, the natural paranoia of someone under constant pressure. But then I began to notice the pattern, deliberate and undeniable. Maplewood Estates had transformed into a neighborhood of watchmen. The HOA didn't need hired security. They had deputized the very people who once waved across hedges and borrowed cups of sugar. Sandra Wells, with her saccharine smile, had spun a web of volunteers. Neighbors turned enforcers armed with clipboards and cameras. They patrolled on foot, on bicycles, even from the passenger seats of their cars, always watching, always reporting. My street, once alive with the laughter of children and the hum of weekend barbecues, now pulsed with a quieter, colder rhythm. Conversation stopped when I approached. Smiles thinned into lines. Eyes followed me, cataloging every gesture. One morning as I left for work, I caught the Smiths, once friendly, now distant, standing at the edge of my yard with a measuring tape. I walked up slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Compliance check," Mr. Smith muttered, avoiding my eyes. "Board requested." His wife scribbled notes furiously on a pad. "On my property?" I pressed, voice low but sharp. He shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer. They turned away, retreating quickly, the tape measure snapping shut with a metallic snap that echoed long after they were gone. By that evening, another letter arrived. Non-compliant lawn edging. Penalty $500. My jaw clenched as I read it. They weren't even trying to hide the harassment anymore. Each day a new invented violation. Each week another layer of pressure. It was never ending. A drip, drip, drip meant to wear me down. The most unsettling change, however, came from the children. I saw them once, 3 of them, maybe 10 or 11 years old, crouched near my fence with a smartphone held high. They darted away when I stepped outside, their giggles cutting through the air. But later that night, as I checked my mailbox, I found a printed photograph inside, blurry but unmistakable, me standing near the dam, shovel in hand, taken from over the fence. Someone had turned play into surveillance, innocence into a weapon. The paranoia grew heavier. I began to scan every window, every car parked too long on the street. When I mowed the lawn, I felt the lenses watching. When I carried groceries inside, I imagined whispers being written into reports. My home was no longer mine. It had become a stage where every act was judged, recorded, and filed. Even Peter Lang, who had once slipped me evidence of their secret meetings, grew distant. He avoided my gaze, retreating indoors when I waved. I couldn't tell if the pressure had broken him or if the board had gotten to him. The isolation thickened, every friendly face turning colder, until I no longer knew who I could trust. The board understood something simple. Fear spreads faster than resistance. By making me the target, they sent a message to everyone else, fall in line or this will be you. And so the neighbors complied, some reluctantly, others with zeal. I overheard Melissa one evening, standing in her driveway speaking loudly enough for me to hear. He thinks he can fight them, she said to another neighbor. But they'll take everything. You'll see. Her laughter followed me inside like smoke seeping under a door. The dam, meanwhile, stood strong, unyielding in the night. But I knew the board wasn't finished. The patrols grew more frequent. Cars idled longer near my driveway. I began to notice small orange stickers on other homes, silent marks of compliance, symbols that said not a threat. My house bore no such sticker. Instead, it bore the weight of their hostility. One night, as rain began to fall, I stood by my window and watched the cul-de-sac. Porch lights flickered on one by one, casting cones of yellow against the wet pavement. Figures moved through the rain, neighbors with umbrellas huddled together, whispering. From my vantage point, it looked less like a community and more like a watch shift, a congregation united not by trust but by fear. I could feel it then deep in my bones. Maplewood Estates had become something else entirely. Not a neighborhood, not a home, a surveillance state in miniature, governed not by laws but by suspicion. The dread gnawed at me, but I so resolved. If they thought they could smother me with fear, they had underestimated me. I had lived through worse in deserts and mountains far from here, where every shadow hid danger. What unsettled me wasn't their watchfulness, it was the betrayal. These were not enemies from another land. These were neighbors, people I had once trusted, weaponized against me, and yet I knew this was only the middle act. Surveillance was just the tightening of the noose. The real blow was still to come. The numbers no longer made sense. They weren't rooted in reason, only in malice. At first it had been 5,000, then 10, then 20. But now the letters bore figures so absurd they read like fiction. 50,000, 6572. Each notice printed with cold precision, each signature at the bottom carrying the smug permanence of a board that believed itself untouchable. My dam, a small wall of stone and timber meant to shield my home, had somehow become a debt greater than most men's livelihoods. One Saturday morning, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by the letters, spread out like the wreckage of a battlefield. They smelled faintly of toner and adhesive, sharp and chemical, filling the house until I felt suffocated. My coffee had gone cold in its mug as I flipped through them again, each one a reminder that they weren't fining me to correct anything. They were trying to break me. The latest notice was the most chilling. Foreclosure proceedings will begin if penalties remain unpaid. Property subject to lien under Bylaw 14C Section 3. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a declaration. I drove to the county office, desperate for clarity, and waited in line beneath flickering fluorescent lights. When I finally sat across from the clerk, she tapped at her computer and frowned. "There's already a lien filed on your property," she said flatly, as though reading a weather report. "Filed by Maplewood Estates HOA. My chest went cold. "How?" I never received notice, she shrugged, sliding the screen away. They filed it electronically. Perfectly legal. I walked out into the bright sun feeling smaller than I ever had, as though the ground itself had been pulled from under me. The board wasn't bluffing. They were already laying siege, not with bulldozers or wrecking crews, but with paperwork sharpened into blades. Then came the false charges. They arrived in envelopes heavier than the usual letters, stuffed with photographs and fabricated reports. One showed trash bags piled at the corner of my lawn, though I had taken them to the curb the night before. Another claimed I had constructed additional unpermitted structures in my yard, citing shadows on the ground as proof. They accused me of endangering children by diverting water, of damaging common property, of violating noise ordinances on nights I had been asleep in my bed. Each accusation carried its own fine, its own weight. And together, they created a mountain so steep I could barely see the top. They weren't just taking my money. They were erasing my reputation, branding me a criminal in the eyes of the very people I had once called neighbors. One afternoon, as I stepped out to check the mail, I found a man in a gray suit waiting by my driveway. He held a leather briefcase and wore a badge clipped to his belt. Not a police badge, but something embossed with the words, Maplewood Estates Security Division. "Mr. Hayes," he said briskly. "You're being served." He handed me a thick envelope and walked away without another word. Inside were legal documents or something pretending to be. Summons, orders, citations, all bearing the HOA's insignia, but none stamped by a court. I sifted through the pages, bile rising in my throat. They had created their own system of law, their own courts, their own enforcers. Fake cops, fake summons, but real consequences. And everyone in the neighborhood treated them as gospel. That night I couldn't eat. My stomach churned as I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen, staring at the papers spread across the table. The shadows of the blinds crawled across the letters like bars, as though my house itself had become a prison cell. By Sunday, word had spread. As I walked down the street, I heard snippets of conversation slip from porches and patios. They say he's endangering the whole community. Did you hear about the lien? He'll lose the house for sure. Honestly, he brought it on himself. Should have just followed the rules. The betrayal cut deeper each time. These were voices I once trusted. Voices that had cheered when I returned from overseas. Voices that had toasted with me over steaks on summer nights. Now they spoke of me like a contagion, something to be purged for the health of the whole. But the worst came at night. I woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside, low and heavy. Pulling the blinds back, I saw trucks idling at the corner, headlights dark, silhouettes moving inside. They stayed for hours, then disappeared before dawn. I knew then the board was preparing something. Something larger. Something final. The fines, the liens, the false charges. They weren't the endgame. They were the prelude. The paperwork to justify what was coming next. And when I looked out at the dam under the silver glow of moonlight, I understood. They weren't just trying to take my home. They were preparing to destroy it. It happened at dawn, the hour when the world is at its quietest, when the cul-de-sac still lies in shadow, and the only sounds are the distant hum of sprinklers and the low chorus of waking birds. I woke to a vibration in the floorboards, a slow rumble that grew until it felt like thunder under my bed. When I pulled the curtain aside, my chest tightened. The trucks had arrived. Flatbeds lined the street, their engines chugging heavy clouds into the pale morning air. Men in reflective vests and hard hats climbed down, carrying sledgehammers, crowbars, and toolboxes. At the front of the convoy sat a larger vehicle, painted white with bold black letters across its side, Maplewood Estates Demolition and Compliance. It was a name designed to look official, but my gut told me it was nothing more than another mask. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch as they began to gather at the edge of my lawn. Sandra Wells was there, clipboard in hand, smiling her saccharine smile as if this were nothing more than a community project. Carol Whitaker, the board president, stood beside her, dressed in a tailored suit far too sharp for the hour, her arms crossed like a general surveying the battlefield. "Mr. Hayes," she called, her voice carrying across the stillness, "you've left us no choice. The unauthorized structure will be removed today." I felt every eye in the neighborhood on me. Curtains twitched, blinds tilted, doors cracked open just enough for shadows to peek through. Children stood barefoot on porches, clutching their parents' legs. It was as though the entire neighborhood had gathered silently to watch a man stripped of what was his. I stepped down onto the grass, the cool dew soaking my boots. My voice came out steady, though my hands trembled. You don't have the authority. Carol's smile didn't falter. Bylaw 14C grants the board authority over unpermitted structures. The fines have gone unpaid. The lien has been filed. This is the natural consequence of defiance. The men began to move toward the backyard, their tools clinking, their boots crushing the wet grass. I walked quickly to intercept them, planting myself between them and the fence. You set 1 foot past this line, I said, my voice sharp as steel, and you'll be trespassing. Sandra tapped her pen against the clipboard. Not trespassing, Mr. Hayes, enforcement. My heart pounded. I could hear the creak behind the fence, the steady rush of water pressing against the dam. That structure was more than stone and timber. It was defiance carved into the earth, and now they were here to erase it, to erase me. The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the air like a storm ready to break. One of the crewmen shifted nervously, looking at Carol for direction. She nodded once curtly. Proceed. 2 men moved forward, crowbars in hand. I spread my arms wide, blocking the gate. My voice boomed across the lawn, louder than I intended, fueled by every ounce of fear and fury inside me. You're not touching it. For a moment, silence fell. Even the birds seemed to stop. Then a voice rose from across the street. It was Melissa, the young neighbor who had once been kind, now twisted into one of their acolytes. Just let them do it, she shouted. You're putting us all at risk. Her words cut, but they also ignited something. I turned, scanning the faces in the windows, the silhouettes on porches. Their fear was palpable, thick in the air, but behind it I saw doubt flicker. Doubt in the board, doubt in the necessity of this spectacle. I turned back to Carol. If you believe you have the law on your side, call the police. Call the county. Call anyone with actual authority. But until then, this is my property, and you don't get to take it. The air trembled with anticipation. Carol's smile faltered for the first time. She glanced at Sandra, then at Thomas Green, who shifted uncomfortably beside her. The crew hesitated, their tools hanging uselessly in their hands. And then, as though summoned by fate itself, the sound of sirens pierced the dawn. Red and blue lights flickered at the end of the street. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, followed by another, their tires crackling against the asphalt. The demolition crew froze. Neighbors leaned farther out their windows, their whispers rising into a nervous hum. The cruiser stopped and 2 deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts. One approached the board, his voice calm but commanding. What's going on here? Carol straightened her suit jacket, masking her unease. This is a compliance matter. The HOA is within its rights. The deputy cut her off. Ma'am, I've reviewed the county code. You don't have jurisdiction to order demolition. Any enforcement beyond fines must go through the courts. The silence that followed was deafening. Carol's face flushed crimson, Sandra's smile cracked, and the crew began to exchange nervous glances. The illusion of authority, the mask they had worn so confidently, began to slip. I stood taller, breathing for the first time in weeks without the weight pressing on my chest. The dam still stood. My home still stood. And for the first time so did I. But as the deputies ordered the crew to leave, I knew this was not the end. The board had been exposed, yes, but they weren't finished. They would retreat, regroup, and find another way. And when they did, the fight would begin anew. For now, though, the siege had broken. And in the silence that followed, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. When the demolition trucks rattled away under the stern gaze of the sheriff's deputies, Maplewood Estates fell into a silence I had never known. It wasn't peace. It was something closer to shock. The board members stood frozen in the cul-de-sac, their authority cracked open for everyone to see. And though the neighbors said nothing, I could feel the shift in the air. Doubt had been planted, and doubt spreads like wildfire in places built on appearances. I thought the battle was over, but what followed was worse for the board than any wrecking crew could deliver. Once the deputies left, I began collecting. Peter Lang returned to my side, no longer hiding in shadows. Together we pieced through the folder he had given me, digging deeper into the board's secret dealings. And what we found was damning. There were payments marked as security stipends, thousands of dollars funneled to men like the one in the grey suit who had served me a fake summons. Their so-called Maplewood Estate Security Division was nothing more than a group of hired imposters, paid out of inflated fines and concealed budgets. They had badges, uniforms, even vehicles, but no certification, no state recognition. They were theatre. Pretend lawmen acting on the whims of Carol and her board, we uncovered correspondence, 2 emails that had been printed and tucked into the folder, showing collusion between the board members to target households deliberately. Focus on Hayes, one message read, Carol's signature at the bottom. Non-compliance must be crushed publicly to deter others. In another, Sandra instructed volunteers to fabricate photographic evidence where necessary. Seeing those words in black and white made my stomach turn. They weren't careless. They weren't mistaken. They were deliberate. With Peter's help, I brought the evidence to the county office. The clerk, who had once looked at me with indifference, now raised her eyebrows at the pile of documents spread across her desk. "If this is real," she murmured, "it's fraud. And impersonating law enforcement is a crime." The investigation began quietly, but news in Maplewood Estates never stayed quiet for long. Soon whispers turned into murmurs into late-night conversations on porches. Neighbors who had once watched me with suspicion now eyed the board with something colder. Melissa no longer shouted across the street. The Smiths stopped their compliance checks and began keeping their blinds drawn. The entire neighborhood seemed to teeter, waiting to see if the empire of bylaws and threats would finally collapse. The turning point came at the next scheduled HOA meeting, when the board expected the usual crowd of subdued homeowners, compliant and unquestioning. Instead, the clubhouse overflowed. Dozens of residents filled the folding chairs, lining the walls, voices low but sharp with anger. I sat near the back with Peter, the folder heavy in my lap, its contents ready to burn through the lies. Carol walked in with her usual poise, dressed in a crisp suit, but her eyes darted nervously across the crowd. Sandra followed, her smile more forced than ever, and Thomas and Alan trailed behind like shadows. They took their places at the long table, shuffling papers as though shuffling would restore their control. Carol began in her rehearsed voice, "We are here to discuss ongoing violations and community standards." She didn't finish. A resident stood up, waving one of the fake summons I had been served. "Is this your idea of community standards? Threatening us with bogus charges?" The room erupted. One after another, residents raised their voices, demanding answers, holding up letters, photographs, citations that had ruined their peace for months or years. And then, when the noise reached its peak, I rose. My voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I have proof," I said. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me as I carried the folder to the front and laid it on the table. I spread the pages wide, emails, memos, payment records. "You've lied. You've stolen. You've turned neighbors into enemies. These fines, these liens, these security forces, they're fraud. You built your power on fear, and today it ends." The board members stared at the papers, their faces pale. Sandra tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. "This is taken out of context." The county investigator, who had slipped quietly into the back of the room, stepped forward. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. A real one, not the plastic imposter shields the board had handed out. "It's more than context," he said firmly. "We've verified the documents. Impersonation of law enforcement. Fraudulent liens. Misappropriation of funds. You'll be answering for this." Carol's composure was shattered. Her lips trembled as residents shouted, demanding resignations, demanding refunds, demanding justice. Thomas slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. Alan muttered under his breath, his glasses fogged. And Sandra, once so smug, sat rigid, her smile gone, her pen still. The mask had fallen. The impostors were exposed, and the lies, once whispered in secret meetings, now unraveled in the bright light of community fury. As I walked out of the clubhouse that night, the air felt different. Neighbors who had once avoided my gaze now met my eyes with something new, respect maybe, or shame. A few even nodded, their silence saying more than words ever could. For the first time, Maplewood Estates belonged not to the board, but to the people who lived there. The war wasn't over. There would be legal battles, hearings, and the slow grind of accountability. But the spell had been broken. Their power was no longer absolute, and for the first time in months I slept without fear. The weeks that followed were not quiet, but they were different. The board that once ruled with sharpened bylaws and weaponized neighbors was stripped of its facade. Carol, Sandra, Thomas, and Alan, names once spoken with either fear or deference, were suddenly attached to words like indictment, fraud, and conspiracy. I read their names in the county paper, saw their faces pale in mugshots that contrasted with the polished portraits they had hung inside the clubhouse. The empire of intimidation they had built collapsed overnight, leaving behind only the fragments of their ambition and the echoes of a community they had poisoned. The HOA itself did not survive. Without its board, its treasury, its security division, Maplewood Estates was left hollow. At first, there was chaos. No one knew who would handle dues, who would schedule landscaping, or who would mediate disputes. But beneath the confusion, there was something else: relief. The letters stopped. The patrols ended. The constant pressure of being watched, measured, and fined dissolved into memory. I noticed it in the smallest of ways. Neighbors who had once drawn their curtains tight now lingered on porches again. Children rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac, without parents watching nervously from behind blinds. The Smiths even crossed the street one evening to bring over a plate of cookies, their eyes heavy with apology. "We thought we had no choice," Mrs. Smith whispered. I accepted their gesture, but I knew some wounds wouldn't heal with sugar and flour. Melissa, the young woman who had once shouted at me to yield, avoided me entirely. I caught her once, standing on her porch as I carried groceries inside, her face etched with something like shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then she turned away. Betrayal had left its mark, and not every bridge could be rebuilt. The dam still stood, weathered by storms but strong. I visited it often, running my hands across the cool stone, listening to the steady rush of water against its base. It was no longer just a barrier against flooding. It was a monument to defiance, a reminder that power only survives when people bow to it. I had refused, and because of that refusal, the truth had come to light. Yet victory did not come without cost. My peace was scarred. I could no longer look at Maplewood Estates the same way. The manicured lawns, the identical mailboxes, the rows of houses once meant to symbolize harmony now felt like illusions, masks that had hidden rot underneath. Every smile carried the weight of past suspicion. Every wave was tinged with the memory of betrayal. There were lawsuits, of course. Families who had been driven out returned with claims against the board, demanding restitution for homes stolen, reputations destroyed. Some succeeded, others did not. Justice moved slowly, grinding like gears that cared little for the lives caught between. But even in its imperfect form, it was enough to shatter the myth of Maplewood's invincibility. One evening, months after the board's downfall, I stood at the end of my driveway and looked out over the cul-de-sac. The air was calm, the sunset painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't waiting for a letter, a knock, a shadow at the window. I breathed deep, and the air didn't taste of dread. Peter Lang joined me, his hands tucked in his pockets. He had become more visible since the collapse, stepping out of his self-imposed isolation. He looked at the neighborhood with tired eyes. "Funny, isn't it?" he said. "All it took was one dam to bring it all down." I smiled faintly. "Water always finds a way." He nodded, and for a moment, silence settled between us. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the fragile quiet of something rebuilding itself. Maplewood Estates would never be the same. And maybe that was a good thing. The scars remained, etched into every driveway, every porch light that once flickered with suspicion. But scars tell stories. They remind us of what was survived, what was fought, and what must never be allowed to happen again. I turned back toward my house, my home, my sanctuary. For the first time in a long time, it felt like mine again. Vindication had come not in triumph, but in endurance. And though peace had been scarred, it was peace nonetheless. The HOA was gone. The imposters were unmasked. The neighborhood was free, and the dam still stood,